The day Silas Mercer's leg shattered beneath 1,000 pounds of spooked horse, he learned what the world really thought of broken men. 3 years later, standing in the freezing mud of Bitter Hollow's single street, waiting for a woman desperate enough to marry a cripple she'd never met, he was about to learn he wasn't the only one the world had thrown away. What happened next would either destroy them both or prove that sometimes the strongest foundations are built on fractured ground. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was late. Silas Mercer stood in the street with his weight shifted hard onto his good leg, his cane sunk 3 inches into half-frozen mud, and tried not to think about how many people were watching. He could feel their eyes from the mercantile porch, from the saloon steps, from the feed store window where old Patterson pretended to be checking invoices, but was really just waiting for the show to start. They'd been waiting for this show for weeks. "Any minute now, Silas," called out Amos Garrett from across the street, his voice carrying that particular kind of friendliness that wasn't friendly at all. "Hope she's got a strong stomach." A few laughs rippled through the small crowd. Silas didn't turn around. His jaw was already tight enough to crack teeth. The January wind came down off the mountains like something with claws, tearing through the gap between buildings and making the painted sign above the general store bang against its chains. Bitter Hollow, Wyoming, population 263, though that number had been painted over twice in the last 5 years, as people gave up and moved on to places with better water or less wind, or maybe just less bitterness in the name. Silas had been born here, grown up riding these hills when they still belonged to the Shoshone, and the big ranches hadn't yet carved up the valley into parcels of impossible dreams. He'd been good on a horse once, better than good. The kind of rider people pointed out to their sons as an example of what a man could be if he had the talent and the nerve. That was before the accident. Before the Palomino mare had spooked at a rattler and gone sideways off the trail. Before the screaming fall and the sound his leg made when the horse came down on top of it. A sound like green wood splintering, a sound he still heard sometimes in the gap between sleeping and waking. Before the doctor, who smelled like whiskey and failure, had done what he could with a bone that had shattered in 6 places. Before Silas's father had looked at him in the bed and said, "Well, that's that then." As if his son had died instead of just become something less useful. The limp was permanent. The pain was permanent. The way people looked at him, or more often, looked away, that was permanent too. "Stagecoach!" someone shouted. Silas's heart kicked against his ribs, even as he told himself to feel nothing. Expecting nothing was easier, safer. The contract had been simple enough. One mail-order bride willing to relocate to Wyoming territory, no questions about past circumstances, room and board provided in exchange for domestic assistance and companionship. He'd left out the part about the limp, the dying ranch, the fact that he lived 10 miles from town on land, so isolated that some weeks he didn't see another human face. He figured she'd leave out things too. That was the arrangement. The stagecoach rattled into view, mud flying from its wheels, the horses blowing hard. It lurched to a stop in front of the hotel, and the driver, a leathery man named Hutchins who'd been running this route since before Silas was born, climbed down from his seat with the careful movements of someone whose back had seen too many bad roads. "Got your package, Mercer," Hutchins called out, and there was enough amusement in his voice that Silas wanted to hit him with the cane. The door opened. A hand appeared first, gloved, practical, gripping the frame with the kind of careful pressure that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust their balance. Then a boot, well worn but clean. Then she stepped down, and the murmuring from the crowd went quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was thinking the same ugly thoughts at once. She was tall, taller than Silas had expected, though still a few inches shorter than his own 6 feet. Her dress was dark wool, travel-stained but well-made, and her coat had been mended at the shoulder with stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. She wore her brown hair pulled back in a way that was meant to be severe but had come loose during the journey, strands escaping around a face that would have been handsome if not for the scar. It ran from her left temple down across her cheekbone, a pale line against skin that had seen weather and worry. Not the clean slice of a knife, but something worse, something that had torn before it healed. Her left eye drooped slightly at the outer corner where the scar tissue pulled, giving her expression a permanent quality of skepticism that Silas suspected had nothing to do with the injury and everything to do with whatever had happened before it. She turned, reaching back into the coach for a single battered trunk, and that's when he saw the limp. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight hitch in her left leg, the kind of thing someone might miss if they weren't looking for it. But Silas knew what he was looking at. The careful weight distribution, the way she braced with her right side before moving the left, the split-second pause before each step that spoke of old pain managed rather than forgotten. She was damaged goods too. The realization hit him with something that felt dangerously close to hope, and he crushed it immediately because hope was the kind of thing that got a man hurt worse than any physical injury. Hutchins handed down her trunk with more gentleness than he'd shown anything else today. The woman, Elena, her name was Elena Voss according to the letters they'd exchanged, took it with a small nod of thanks and turned to face the street. Her eyes found Silas immediately. He didn't know how she knew which one he was out of the dozen men standing around, but she did. Maybe it was the cane. Maybe it was the look on his face that matched the look on hers, the expression of someone who'd learned to expect the worst and was rarely disappointed. She walked toward him. Each step was deliberate, her chin up in a way that dared anyone to comment. The crowd watched in silence. Silas could feel their judgment, like a physical weight, crushing down on both of them. And something twisted in his chest that might have been rage, or might have been recognition. She stopped 3 feet away. Up close, he could see that her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over the mountains, and they were studying him with the same careful assessment he was giving her. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was lower than he'd expected, with an accent that put her origins somewhere east, Pennsylvania maybe, or Ohio. Educated. A schoolteacher's daughter or a merchant's wife, someone who'd fallen from a place with better manners than this. "Mrs. Voss." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that felt absurdly formal under the circumstances. "The wagon's just there. It's a rough ride out to the ranch." "I've had rough rides before." Something flickered across her face, memory maybe, or warning. "I can manage." "I wasn't suggesting—" He stopped, realizing how defensive he sounded. Started again. "There's a storm coming in tonight. We should get moving." She nodded, turned to pick up her trunk. Silas moved to help her, and their hands touched on the leather handle, both of them pulling back like they'd been burned, both pretending they hadn't. "I got it," she said. "It's heavy." "I said I got it." They stood there in a brief, stupid standoff until Silas realized that she was testing him, seeing if he'd push, if he'd insist, if he'd use his greater strength to take control of even this small thing. He stepped back. "Wagon's there," he repeated, gesturing with the cane. She lifted the trunk, and he could see it cost her, could see the slight tremor in her arms, and the way she had to pivot on her good leg to get the weight distributed. But she carried it the 20 feet to the wagon and set it in the bed without asking for help. Behind them, someone laughed. Not a kind laugh. "Well, ain't that a matched pair," said a voice Silas recognized as belonging to Curtis Webb, a small man with a smaller mind who worked at the livery. "Cripple and a scar face, like something out of a carnival." Elena's back stiffened. Silas felt his hand tighten on the cane hard enough that the wood creaked. He could turn around. He could confront Webb, who was half his size and all mouth. He could start something that would end with him on his back in the mud because his leg wouldn't hold him through a fight, and everyone knew it. Or he could do what he'd learned to do over the past 3 years, swallow it down, add it to the pile of swallowed things, and keep moving. Elena made the choice for both of them. She turned slowly and looked at Curtis Webb with the kind of steady, unblinking attention that made small men uncomfortable. Didn't say a word. Just looked at him until his laughter died and his face started to redden, and he found somewhere else to put his eyes. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat, arranged her skirts, and waited. Silas stood there for a moment, feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't have words for. Then he hauled himself up onto the seat beside her, his bad leg screaming in protest, his pride screaming louder, and took up the reins. "Let's go home," he said. The word tasted strange in his mouth. Home. As if the falling down ranch house 10 miles from anywhere could be called that. As if anywhere could be home for two people who'd been thrown away by everyone they'd ever known. He clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon lurched forward, carrying them out of town through streets that had suddenly gone quiet. The crowd watched them go. Silas could feel their eyes like brands between his shoulder blades, pity and contempt and satisfaction that at least they weren't as pathetic as those two. They didn't speak for the first mile. The road climbed gradually out of the valley floor, following a creek that was more ice than water this time of year. The wind picked up as they gained elevation, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet but would before morning. The horses leaned into their collars, their breath steaming in the cold air. Finally, Elena spoke. "How long have you been alone out here?" 3 years. He kept his eyes on the road. "Since the accident. What happened?" "Horse fell on me, broke my leg in 6 places. Doctor did what he could." Silas paused, then added with a bitterness he couldn't quite hide, "Wasn't enough." She nodded slowly, didn't offer sympathy or platitudes, which he appreciated more than she could know. "My family decided I wasn't much use after that," he continued, surprising himself by talking at all. "Sold their half of the ranch and moved to California. Left me the house and 200 acres of scrubland that barely supports a dozen cattle. Said I should sell too, get myself a job in town doing something I could manage. Clerking, maybe. Bookkeeping. But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" Silas thought about it. Spite, mostly. That got a sound from her that might have been a laugh or might have been agreement. She shifted on the seat, and he saw her wince. Just a flicker, quickly hidden. "Your leg?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "My business." "Fair enough." He was quiet for another minute, then said, "There's a doctor in town if you need." "I don't need a doctor." Her voice had gone flat. "I need a roof and a place to be that isn't where I was. That's the agreement. That's all the agreement is." Message received. He didn't push. They climbed higher. The valley opened up below them, Bitter Hollow shrinking to a handful of buildings huddled against the wind. Beyond the town, the land rolled away in waves of brown grass and gray stone, broken by stands of pine that looked black against the snow. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The kind of beauty that didn't care if you appreciated it or not. "It's isolated," Silas said, feeling like he should warn her, even though it was too late for warnings. "The nearest neighbor is 8 miles east. In winter, sometimes the road gets snowed in for weeks. We get supplies every month if the weather holds, but otherwise it's just—" He trailed off. Just what? Just silence and wind and the slow, grinding work of trying to keep a dying ranch alive? "It's quiet," he finished lamely. "Good." Elena's voice was soft but certain. "I've had enough of noise." He glanced at her sidelong. She was looking out at the landscape with an expression he couldn't read. Not quite wonder, not quite fear. Something in between. Her gloved hands were folded in her lap, holding each other tightly. "The house isn't much," he continued. 2 rooms. Needs repairs I haven't had the money or the, He gestured vaguely at his leg. "Haven't been able to do. The roof leaks in the back bedroom. Stove works, but it's temperamental. There's a well that's good, at least. Clean water, that's something." "It's more than I had." The simplicity of the statement hung between them. Silas wanted to ask what she'd had before, what she was running from, what had put the scar on her face and the limp in her step, and the careful guardedness in every word she spoke. But he'd meant what he'd said about the agreement, room and board, companionship, no questions about past circumstances. They'd both signed that contract knowing what it meant. We are people who cannot afford the luxury of honesty. The road narrowed as it wound through a stand of pines, the branches pressing in close enough to brush the wagon sides. Shadows pooled thick and cold beneath the trees. A magpie called out, harsh and mocking, then went silent. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady plod of the horses' hooves, and the wind that never really stopped this high in the mountains. "Are you afraid of me?" Elena asked suddenly. Silas almost laughed. "Should I be? I don't know." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd left town. "You sent for a wife. You got something else. A woman with a face that makes children stare and a past she won't discuss. Maybe you're having second thoughts." "Are you?" I asked first. He considered the question seriously. Was he afraid? Of her specifically? No. Of what this arrangement might become, of the ways it could fail, of the possibility that even this desperate grab at something resembling a human connection might blow up in his face the way everything else had. Yes. But that wasn't what she was asking. "I'm not afraid of you," he said. "I'm not sure what I am, but it's not that." She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded and turned back to the road. "All right. All right?" That's honest enough. I can work with honest. They emerged from the trees onto a high meadow, and there it was, the ranch house, such as it was. A single-story structure of rough-cut logs, weathered silver by wind and sun, with a chimney at one end leaking a thin trail of smoke. The barn next to it sagged badly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched boards. Beyond them, a split-rail fence enclosed a bare paddock where 3 horses and a handful of cattle stood with their backs to the wind. It looked exactly like what it was, a place where someone was barely hanging on. Elena was silent as they approached. Silas tried to see it through her eyes, the isolation, the shabbiness, the clear evidence of work not done and repairs not made. He waited for disappointment or disgust, or the particular kind of pity that was worse than contempt. "The mountains," she said quietly. "You can see them from here." He followed her gaze. North and west, the peaks of the Wind River Range cut into the sky like broken teeth, white with snow even in late January. They were 50 miles away but looked close enough to touch in the clear air. "Yeah," he said, "every morning. I've never lived anywhere with mountains before." Something in her voice had softened just slightly. "In Pennsylvania, everything was—" She paused, searching for words. "Closed in. Trees and hills and houses all pressing together. This is different. It's empty." "Yes." She said it like it was a good thing. "Very empty." Silas pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. His leg had gone stiff during the drive, and getting down was going to hurt. He braced himself, started to swing his good leg over, and felt Elena's hand suddenly grip his arm. "Wait," she said. He froze. Her hand on his arm was the first deliberate touch they'd shared, and he could feel the strength in her grip even through his coat sleeve. "Let me get down first," she said. "You'll need to hand me the trunk." It took him a moment to realize what she was doing, giving him an excuse to take his time, to lower himself from the wagon seat without an audience, to not have to pretend his leg wasn't screaming. Small kindness or calculated strategy, he wasn't sure. Maybe both. "All right," he said. She released his arm and climbed down, moving carefully but competently. Once on the ground, she turned back and reached for the trunk. He slid it to the edge of the wagon bed, and together they lowered it down. Then she stepped away, ostensibly to look at the house, giving him privacy to manage his own descent. Silas took a breath and dropped down. His leg buckled when he hit the ground. It always did, and he caught himself hard on the wagon wheel, pain shooting up from ankle to hip in a white-hot line that made his vision gray at the edges. He stood there for a moment, breathing through his teeth, until the worst of it passed. When he turned around, Elena was examining the door frame like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen, but there was tension in her shoulders that said she'd heard everything and was choosing to ignore it. Dignity and pretense. He could respect that. "Come on," he said, retrieving his cane from the wagon seat. "I'll show you around. Won't take long." The inside of the house was about what Elena had expected, and somehow worse because of that. One main room serving as kitchen, dining area, and living space, dominated by a cast-iron stove that radiated heat in a radius of about 6 feet before giving up, a rough table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a sparse collection of dishes and supplies, a doorway leading to what she assumed was the bedroom, currently covered by a blanket hung from a rope. It was clean, which surprised her. Sparse and shabby, but not dirty. The floors had been swept recently. The dishes were washed and stacked. The stove had been blacked, the ash bucket emptied. A man living alone didn't usually bother with such things, but Silas Mercer apparently had. "Bedroom's through there," Silas said, gesturing at the blanket door with his cane. "I've been sleeping out here since—" He paused. "You'll take the bedroom. I'll make do with the chair or a bedroll by the stove." Elena turned to look at him. That wasn't the arrangement. His jaw tightened. "I'm not going to force you into—" "I didn't say you would." She cut him off with the same flat certainty she'd used earlier. "But we agreed to a marriage. You paid for my passage, and I signed the contract. Running separate households in a 2-room cabin defeats the purpose. The purpose was companionship, and the purpose was survival for both of us. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Elena pulled off her gloves, finger by finger, and set them on the table. "You needed someone to help run this place because you can't do it alone anymore. I needed somewhere to be that wasn't—" She stopped herself, started again. "I'm not expecting romance, Mr. Mercer. I'm expecting an arrangement that works. We're both adults. We both understand what that means. Silas stared at her for a long moment. She could see him wrestling with something, pride probably, or some outdated notion of chivalry that had no place in a situation like theirs. Finally, he nodded. All right, Sim, he said. But there's 2 beds in there. Been meaning to move one out, but I haven't gotten around to it. So you'll have your own space regardless. That's fine. An awkward silence fell between them. Elena looked around the room again, cataloging work to be done. The windows needed caulking. The stovepipe had a crack that was leaking smoke. The floorboards near the door were warped from water damage. A winter's worth of deferred maintenance stared back at her from every corner. Good. She was better with work than with words. I'll need to see the supplies, she said. Figure out what we have for meals. And I'll need to know the routine. When you feed the stock, what needs doing daily versus weekly. If there's laundry, I should know where... Elena. His voice stopped her mid-sentence. She realized she'd been talking faster and faster, words spilling out in a rush that had nothing to do with household management and everything to do with the panic that was suddenly trying to claw its way up her throat. The panic that said she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd traded one trap for another, that this isolated ranch house might be worse than what she'd left behind. Because at least in Philadelphia there had been neighbors who could hear screaming. She closed her eyes, breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she'd taught herself to do when the fear got loud. When she opened her eyes again, Silas was watching her with an expression that was too knowing for comfort. There's coffee, he said quietly. Still hot from this morning. Why don't you sit down and I'll pour you a cup? Then we can talk about all that other stuff. It wasn't a command. It was an offer. The difference mattered. Elena nodded and lowered herself carefully into one of the chairs. Her leg was aching from the long journey, a deep throb that meant she'd be limping worse tomorrow. Silas moved to the stove, favoring his own bad leg, and poured coffee into 2 tin cups with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to compensate for limited mobility. He brought them to the table and sat down across from her, his cane propped against his chair. They drank in silence for a moment. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed. The scar, Silas said finally, and the limp. Same incident? Elena's hand tightened on her cup. I thought we agreed no questions about the past. We did, but if I'm going to accidentally do or say something that sets you off, I'd rather know about it now than find out the hard way later. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd agreed to marry sight unseen, this stranger who was now the only person standing between her and complete isolation. His face was weathered, lined with pain that had nothing to do with his injury. There were scars there too, though his weren't written on the skin. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they were watching her with something that looked almost like understanding. My husband did it, she heard herself say. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion. Facts, not feelings. Easier that way. He was drunk. It wasn't the first time he'd hit me, but it was the worst. He threw me down the stairs and I hit the banister wrong. Broke my hip. Tore my face open on a nail. She touched the scar without meaning to, then dropped her hand. He was very sorry afterward. He always was. Silas's face had gone still and hard. Was? He's dead. Cholera 2 years ago. Half the city got it that summer. He was one of the unlucky ones. Elena paused, then added with brutal honesty, I wasn't sorry. Good. The word came out harsh. You shouldn't be. She blinked, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. Most people, the few she'd told, had offered sympathy for her loss, uncomfortable with her lack of grief. Silas Mercer was the first person who'd simply agreed that the man deserved to die. What about yours? She asked. Besides the obvious, I mean. What made you put an ad in the matrimonial paper for a woman you'd never met? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. After the accident, my father decided I wasn't worth the investment anymore. He'd been planning to leave the ranch to me, but a son who can't ride or do hard labor isn't much use on a frontier cattle operation, so he sold out. Took my mother and my 2 younger brothers and moved to Sacramento, where my uncle has a shipping business. Left me here with the worst land and a mortgage I can barely make payments on. Why didn't you go with them? His laugh was ugly, Wasn't invited. My father made it pretty clear that a cripple would be a burden on the family's prospects. Better to cut losses and start fresh. He took a drink of coffee. My fiancée agreed with him, apparently, broke off our engagement 3 weeks after the accident, married a railroad man 6 months later. I'm sorry. Don't be. She did me a favor, really. Showed me what people are actually made of when things get difficult. He looked up at Elena. That's when I realized, if I was going to survive out here, I needed help. But everyone in town already sees me as half a man, charity case, object of pity. I couldn't stand the thought of hiring on some local woman who'd feel sorry for me, or worse, who'd think she could fix me. His jaw tightened. I don't need fixing. I just need a partner, Elena finished. Someone who understands that survival isn't pretty and doesn't owe you anything except honesty. Yeah, he met her eyes. That. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The light was already starting to fade, even though it wasn't quite 3 in the afternoon. January days were short this far north, and the storm Silas had mentioned was rolling in faster than expected. Elena could see clouds massing over the mountains, dark and heavy with snow. I should bring in more wood, Silas said, starting to push up from his chair. Storm's coming, and we'll want to keep the fire. I'll get it. Elena was on her feet before he could protest. You've been driving all afternoon. Rest your leg. I don't need you to, I know you don't. She pulled her coat back on and wrapped her scarf around her neck. But I'm getting the wood anyway. You can either tell me where it's stacked, or you can sit there and be stubborn about it. Your choice. A muscle twitched in his jaw. For a moment she thought he was going to argue purely on principle, but then he sighed and gestured toward the back of the house. Around the side, under the eave, there's a canvas covering the stack. Bring in as much as you can carry. We'll need it through the night. Elena nodded and headed for the door. As she stepped out into the wind, she heard him call after her. Elena? She paused, looking back. Thank you. She didn't respond, just pulled the door shut behind her and walked around the side of the house, following the worn path through the snow. The woodpile was exactly where he'd said, protected from the worst of the weather by a crude overhang and covered with a tarp weighted down with rocks. Elena pulled back the canvas and started loading split logs into the crook of her arm, stacking them carefully so they wouldn't slip. Her hip protested the bending and lifting, sending sharp complaints up her spine with each movement. She ignored it. Pain was familiar. Pain was manageable. Pain was better than the alternative, which was sitting inside with a man she barely knew, trying to figure out if she'd made a terrible mistake or possibly the first smart decision of her entire life. The wind gusted hard enough to nearly knock her off balance. She braced against it, logs clutched to her chest, and looked out at the darkening landscape. The mountains were disappearing into cloud. The valley below was filling with shadow. In another hour, it would be full dark, and then the storm would hit in earnest, and she and Silas Mercer would be alone in this house, with nothing but each other for company until spring decided to arrive. The thought should have terrified her. Strangely, it didn't. Maybe she was too tired to be afraid. Maybe she'd used up all her fear back in Philadelphia, in a house where every footstep on the stairs made her flinch, where every slammed door meant she had to calculate escape routes and assess the level of rage in her husband's voice to decide if she had minutes or seconds to get away. Thomas Voss had been a respected man, a merchant with a successful business, a member of the church, well-liked by his peers. No one would have believed what he became behind closed doors after he'd been drinking. No one would have helped her if she'd asked. She'd learned that the hard way. When he died, violent and messy, the cholera taking him in less than 48 hours, the relief had been so intense it felt like violence itself. She'd stood at his grave and felt nothing but gratitude that the ground was between them now. People had whispered about her lack of emotion, about the way she'd sold the house and business barely a month later, taking far less than they were worth just to be rid of them, about how she'd left Philadelphia without a word to anyone. Let them whisper. Their opinions couldn't hurt her anymore. Elena gathered the last few logs and turned back toward the house. Through the window, she could see Silas sitting at the table, his head bowed over something she couldn't make out from this angle. The lamplight caught the silver in his dark hair, made shadows of the lines on his face. He looked tired. He looked lonely. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd been discarded and was trying to figure out how to live with it. She knew the feeling. By the time she made her third trip from the woodpile, Full dark had fallen, and the snow had started. Not gently, but in thick driving sheets that turned the world white within minutes. Elena stacked the last load by the stove and shook the snow from her coat and hair, her fingers already going numb despite her gloves. "That's enough," Silas said from where he was now standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot that smelled like beans and salt pork. "We'll be snowed in by morning anyway. Can't do much about that." Elena hung her coat on the peg by the door and moved closer to the stove, holding her hands out to the heat. "Does this happen often?" "Often enough. Last winter I was trapped in here for 3 weeks straight in February. Had to dig tunnels to get to the barn to feed the stock." He ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. "Learned pretty quick to keep supplies laid in and not count on getting to town more than once a month from December through March." They ate in silence, too hungry and tired for conversation. The stew was simple but hot, and Elena realized she hadn't eaten since early that morning in the stagehouse. The bread Silas put out was a few days old and hard, but she soaked it in the stew and ate it anyway. Outside, the storm built to a howl. The wind screamed around the corners of the house, looking for ways in. Snow hissed against the windows. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the stove's best efforts. Elena could see her breath when she moved away from the direct heat. "We should probably turn in," Silas said, collecting the empty bowls. "Storm like this, we'll want to conserve heat, and you've had a long day." Elena nodded, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The weight of everything, the journey, the decision, the strangeness of this new life, pressed down on her like a physical thing. She stood and made her way to the bedroom, pulling aside the blanket that served as a door. The room beyond was small and dim, lit only by the lamp Silas had already brought in and set on a crate that served as a bedside table. 2 narrow beds were pushed against opposite walls, each with a thin mattress and a pile of quilts. The walls were bare logs, the floor unfinished planks. It smelled like cold stone and old wood smoke. It was the most welcoming space Elena had seen in years. She sank down onto the nearer bed and started unlacing her boots with fingers that shook from more than just cold. Behind her, she heard Silas enter the room, his uneven footsteps distinctive even on the plank floor. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it," he said quietly. "And extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. It'll get cold tonight, even with the stove going." "Thank you." He hesitated, and she felt the weight of all the things neither of them was saying. This was their wedding night, after a fashion. Under normal circumstances, expectations would be clear. But these weren't normal circumstances, and they weren't normal people. "Elena," he said finally, "I meant what I said earlier. I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not willing to give. We're married on paper, but that's all it has to be if that's what you need. I won't—" He stopped, started again. "You're safe here. From me, at least. I want you to know that." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, his face half in shadow. There was something raw in his expression, something vulnerable that she suspected he didn't show often. "I believe you," she said, and realized it was true. He nodded once, then turned away. "Get some sleep. Morning comes early." He pulled the blanket door closed behind him, and Elena was alone. She finished undressing down to her chemise, hung her dress on the peg, and crawled under the pile of quilts. The mattress was lumpy, and the pillow was flat, but it was clean, and it was hers, and no one was going to burst through that door in a rage. Through the thin walls, she could hear Silas moving around in the main room, banking the stove, checking the door, settling himself somewhere to sleep. The familiar sounds of another human being existing in the same space should have made her tense, should have triggered the hypervigilance that had kept her alive for the last years of her marriage. Instead, she felt herself relaxing, her muscles unclenching, her breathing deepening. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Voss fell asleep without fear. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the valley under feet of snow and sealing them away from the rest of the world. Inside, 2 damaged people slept in separate rooms of a house that wasn't quite a home yet, but might be someday. If they could both survive long enough to build it. The storm lasted 3 days. Elena woke that first morning to a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. No wind, no sound of animals, just the profound quiet of deep snow muffling everything beyond the walls. She lay under the quilts for a moment, orienting herself to this new reality, the unfamiliar room, the cold air on her face, the absence of fear in her chest where it usually lived. From the main room came the sound of someone moving carefully, trying not to make noise. Silas, already up. Elena pushed back the blankets and dressed quickly in the freezing air, her fingers clumsy with cold as she fastened buttons and laced boots. When she pulled aside the blanket door, she found him crouched by the stove, feeding in split wood with movements that were stiff and slow. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready?" "How much snow?" "Haven't checked yet. Was waiting for enough light to see by." He straightened with visible effort, one hand braced on his knee. "But from the sound of it last night, we're buried pretty deep." Elena moved to the window and scraped frost from the glass with her fingernail. What she saw made her breath catch. Snow had drifted against the house nearly to the windowsill, turning the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white that hurt to look at in the gray dawn light. The barn was barely visible through the still falling flakes, just a dark shape in the whiteness. "The animals," she said. "Yeah." Silas was pulling on his coat, his mouth set in a grim line. "We need to dig our way to the barn. They'll need feed and water, and the milk cow will need tending." "I'll help." He glanced at her, and she saw him start to protest, saw the automatic dismissal that came from 3 years of doing everything alone, then stop himself. "All right, bundle up. It's going to be cold as hell out there." They spent the next 2 hours digging. Silas had 2 shovels, both worn smooth from use, and they took turns breaking through the drifts that had piled against the door and carved a narrow trench toward the barn. The snow was heavy and wet, each shovelful a strain on muscles and joints that protested the work. Elena's hips screamed at her with every twist and lift, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving because the alternative was watching Silas do it alone while his bad leg threatened to give out with every step. By the time they reached the barn, both of them were sweating despite the cold, their breath coming in harsh gasps that turned to ice crystals in the air. Inside, the animals were restless but alive. 3 horses, a milk cow, and 6 head of cattle that looked at them with accusatory eyes that said they were late with breakfast. Silas set about measuring out feed while Elena found the milking stool and settled herself next to the cow, who stamped irritably but then settled when Elena's hands found the familiar rhythm. "You've done this before," Silas said, watching her work. "My grandmother had a farm outside Harrisburg. I spent summers there as a girl." Elena rested her forehead against the cow's warm flank, letting muscle memory guide her hands. "Before my father decided I needed to be educated properly, and sent me to a finishing school in Philadelphia." "Where you met your husband?" "Where I met a lot of men like my husband." The milk hissed into the bucket in steady streams. "Thomas was just the one who asked first and seemed the least objectionable at the time. My father approved of the match. Good family, solid business prospects." Her voice went flat. "I was 19 and stupid enough to think I had a choice in the matter." Silas was quiet for a moment, spreading hay for the horses. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. "How old are you now?" 28. "You?" 32. He paused. "We're not that old when you think about it. Young enough that most people would say we have time to start over, find someone better, build a different life. But we're not most people. No." He scattered the last of the hay and leaned against the stall rail, taking weight off his bad leg. "Most people don't understand that some things break you in ways that don't heal. They want to believe anyone can bounce back from anything if they just try hard enough. It makes them feel safer, like bad things only happen to people who deserve them somehow." Elena finished milking and stood, carrying the bucket carefully across the barn floor. "What happened to your leg? Was it just the accident, or did the doctor make it worse?" His jaw tightened. "Both. Doc Harrison was the only physician within 50 miles, and he was drunk more often than he was sober. I was unconscious when they brought me in, which was probably a mercy. When I woke up, he told me the leg would likely heal, but I'd walk with a limp. What he didn't tell me was that he'd set the bone wrong in 3 places, and that the infection he'd introduced with his dirty instruments would eat away at the tissue and leave me with nerve damage that makes every step feel like walking on broken glass." "Did you sue him?" Silas laughed, bitter and sharp. "With what? I couldn't afford another doctor to testify against him, and even if I could, Harrison's brother-in-law is the territorial judge. The whole thing was sewn up before it started." He pushed away from the stall. "That's when I learned the most important lesson about frontier justice. It only exists if you're rich enough or connected enough to afford it." They worked in silence after that, finishing the morning chores with the efficiency of two people who understood that talk was cheap and work was what kept you alive. By the time they trudged back through the snow trench to the house, the sun had burned through the clouds enough to turn the landscape blindingly bright. Inside, Elena heated the milk and made breakfast while Silas sat at the table and pulled off his boots with hands that shook from exertion. His face was gray with pain, but he didn't complain. She noticed he didn't complain about much of anything, just set his jaw and pushed through it the way someone did when they'd learned that complaints changed nothing. She fried eggs and the last of the bacon, made more coffee, sliced bread. When she set the plate in front of him, their eyes met for just a moment, and something passed between them that wasn't quite friendship, but was maybe the beginning of understanding. They ate without speaking. Outside, the snow had started again, lighter this time, but steady. They were going to be trapped here for days, maybe weeks, just the two of them and the endless white silence. Elena found she didn't mind. The second day brought routine, morning chores, breakfast, then the work of survival. Silas showed Elena where everything was kept. The root cellar with its dwindling stores of potatoes and turnips and carrots, the smokehouse with its few remaining hams, the pantry with its bags of flour and cornmeal and dried beans. They took inventory together, calculating how long supplies would last if they were careful. "We're low on coffee," Elena said, making notes on a scrap of paper, "and we'll be out of flour by the end of February unless we ration it. There's more in town, but getting there is the problem." Silas frowned at the shelves. "Even after the snow clears, the road will be mud for a week. Wagon won't make it." "Can you ride?" His face went hard. "Not well. Not anymore." Elena heard what he didn't say. That getting on a horse meant admitting defeat in a way that walking with a cane somehow didn't, that it meant confronting the thing that had broken him in the first place. She didn't push. Instead, she spent the afternoon attacking the house itself. The place hadn't had a woman's attention in years. And it showed. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat dust from the mattresses and blankets. She found rags and stuffed them into the gaps around the windows where cold air leaked in. She organized the pantry, cleaned the stove until it gleamed, swept cobwebs from corners that probably hadn't been touched since Silas's mother left. He watched her work with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and shame, as if her efforts were a mirror reflecting his own failures. "You don't have to do all this," he said finally, standing in the doorway while she scrubbed the table. "I know I don't have to." Elena didn't look up. "But I'm doing it anyway. This is my home now too. I'd like it to be livable." "It's not much of a home. It's better than what I had." She paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I need something to do with my hands. If I sit still too long, I start thinking. Thinking isn't helpful." He understood that. She could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way he nodded and went back to his own work without further comment. They were both running from ghosts. At least here, they could run together. That evening, with the stove radiating heat and supper finished, they sat at the table with the lamp between them, and Silas pulled out a battered ledger. "I need to be honest with you about the finances," he said, opening to a page covered in cramped handwriting. "You should know what you've gotten yourself into." Elena leaned forward, studying the columns of numbers. It wasn't good. The mortgage payment alone ate up most of what the ranch generated in a year, and that was assuming they could sell cattle at a decent price, which they hadn't been able to do for the last 2 seasons because the market was glutted and the railroads were charging premium rates to ship anything north. "How far behind are you?" she asked. 3 months. Bank's been patient, but that won't last forever." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking if I can just hold on until spring, maybe the market will improve. Maybe I can breed the horses and sell the foals. Maybe something will change." "Maybe isn't a plan." "No." He looked at her, and there was something desperate in his eyes that he was trying to hide. "But it's all I've got." Elena studied the ledger in silence, her mind working through possibilities. She'd kept the books for Thomas's business after his bookkeeper quit, so she knew her way around accounts. This wasn't complicated mathematics, it was just brutal arithmetic. They needed money, and they needed it soon, or the bank would foreclose and Silas would lose everything. "What about the cattle?" she asked. "How many head do you have?" 14 now, lost 2 last winter. And they're worth what, $20 a head? In town maybe, but getting them to market when I can barely ride is the problem. Last year, I had to hire Garrett's son to drive them in for me, and he kept half the profit as payment. That's robbery. That's survival. Silas closed the ledger with more force than necessary. Everyone in town knows I'm desperate. They can charge whatever they want because I don't have choices anymore. Elena sat back, thinking. An idea was forming, but it was risky, and she wasn't sure how Silas would take it. Finally, she spoke. What if we didn't sell in town? What if we drove them to the railhead ourselves? He stared at her. That's 40 miles, through mountains, in late winter. Early spring, she corrected. By March, the pass should be clear enough, and 40 miles is only 3 days if we push them hard. Maybe 4. I told you, I can't ride. You can ride well enough to sit a horse for a few hours a day. I've seen men with worse injuries than yours work cattle drives. She leaned forward, pressing her point. And I can ride. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not going to let this place go under because we're too proud or too scared to do what needs doing. Silas was shaking his head before she finished. It's not about pride. It's about the fact that I'm a liability out there. If something goes wrong, if the cattle spook or we run into trouble, I can't move fast enough to be useful. I'll get you hurt trying to compensate for me. Or you'll be exactly as useful as any other person on a cattle drive, because most of the work is just being there and not falling asleep. Elena held his gaze. Listen to me. We can sit here and slowly starve while the bank takes this place piece by piece, or we can take a risk. Those are the only 2 options. There's a third option. I sell out now, take what I can get, and find work somewhere that doesn't require... He gestured angrily at his leg. This. And what about me? The question stopped him cold. Elena pressed her advantage. You think I can just move to town and find work as a domestic with my face looking like this? You think anyone's going to hire a woman with a limp and a scar to clean their house or tend their children? Her voice was hard. I came here because this was the only option I had left. If you sell, I'm right back where I started, alone, broke, and too damaged for anyone to want. So before you make decisions about giving up, remember that it's not just your life you're gambling with anymore. The silence between them was thick and tense. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance across Silas's face. You're right, he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. I wasn't thinking about... I'm not used to having to consider someone else. I know. Elena's voice softened slightly. But we're partners now, for better or worse. That means we make decisions together. And right now I'm telling you that I think we can do this. It won't be easy, and it won't be pretty, but we can do it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him struggling with something, probably the same pride and fear that had kept him isolated for 3 years, the voice that said he was useless and broken and not worth the effort. Then something shifted in his expression, and he nodded slowly. All right, he said. Come spring, we'll try it your way. But we do it smart. We scout the route first, make sure the pass is clear, wait for the right weather window. And if at any point it looks like it's going to get one of us killed, we turn back. Agreed? Agreed. They shook hands across the table, and Elena felt the calluses on his palm that matched her own. Workers' hands, survivors' hands. It wasn't much to build a partnership on, but it was something. The third day brought a break in the weather. The snow stopped, the sun came out, and the temperature rose just enough that the world stopped feeling quite so hostile. Silas and Elena dug out the trench to the barn again, fed the animals, and then stood in the yard looking at the landscape that had transformed overnight from gray and threatening to brilliant and almost beautiful. Want to check the fence line? Silas asked. See if anything came down in the storm? They walked the perimeter of the property, or at least as much of it as they could reach through the snow. Several sections of fence had collapsed under the weight of ice and drifts. They'd need to be repaired before the cattle could be moved to different pastures in spring. Silas stood staring at the broken rails with his jaw tight, and Elena knew he was calculating the cost. In materials, in time, in physical effort he wasn't sure his body could provide. We'll fix it together, she said, one section at a time. You don't know what you're signing up for. Fence work is brutal. It's cold and your hands bleed and your back screams at you the whole time. Sounds like every other day of my marriage. I'll manage. He gave her a look that was almost a smile. You're tougher than you look. I'd have to be. They walked back to the house as the sun started to sink toward the mountains. painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that would have been pretty if they weren't both too tired and sore to appreciate it. Inside, Elena started supper while Silas collapsed into the chair by the stove with a groan he tried to hide. "How bad is it?" she asked without turning around. "How bad is what?" "Your leg, right now. Don't lie to me." There was a pause. Then, "Bad. Worst it's been in months. Cold makes the nerves act up, and I pushed too hard today." Elena left the stove and went to the bedroom, returning with a jar of something that smelled sharp and medicinal. "My grandmother made this, for her arthritis. It won't fix anything, but it helps with the pain." "What's in it?" "Arnica, wintergreen, a few other things. I don't remember all of it." She set the jar on the table. "You can try it or not. Your choice." He picked up the jar, studying it with that careful suspicion that said he'd been disappointed too many times to trust easy solutions. But then he unscrewed the lid and the smell filled the room, piney and sharp. And something in his expression shifted. "My mother used to make something like this," he said quietly, "before she left." "Then you know it works." That night, after supper was finished and the dishes were washed, Silas disappeared into the bedroom and came back out 20 minutes later walking slightly easier than before. He didn't say anything about it, and Elena didn't either. Some kindnesses were better unspoken. They settled into chairs on opposite sides of the stove. The lamp turned low to save oil, and sat in comfortable silence while the fire crackled and the house creaked around them. It was the first time since Elena had arrived that they'd simply existed together without work or conversation or the awkward dance of figuring out boundaries. "Can I ask you something?" Silas said finally. She looked up from the sock she was darning. "All right. Why did you answer my advertisement? There must have been others, men with money, men without—" He gestured vaguely at himself. "Without all this baggage." Elena set down her mending and thought about how to answer honestly. There were other advertisements. Quite a few. Most of them wanted someone young and pretty and willing to bear children immediately. Several specifically said they wouldn't accept anyone with disfigurement or disability. Her mouth twisted. "Yours was different. You said you needed a partner, not a decoration. Someone who understood that survival mattered more than sentiment. I appreciated the honesty. Even though I didn't mention the leg or the ranch or how desperate I actually was. Even though," she paused, "I figured if a man was willing to advertise for a mail-order bride, he was either desperate, damaged, or both. At least you were honest about the loneliness. Most of them tried to make it sound like an adventure, like I'd be doing them some kind of favor by agreeing to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere. Your letter just said, 'This is hard and it's lonely and I need help.' That felt true." It was true. He stared into the fire. "It's true. This place is killing me slowly. Not the work. I can handle work, even with the leg. But the isolation. The knowing that everyone in town sees me as broken and pathetic. The way my own father couldn't wait to be rid of me." His voice dropped. "I was starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe I should just give up, sell out, find some corner to die in quietly, where I wouldn't be such an embarrassment. And now?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that was too complicated to name. "Now I have a reason to keep trying, even if it's just spite. Even if it's just to prove to everyone that the crippled rancher and the scarred widow could make something work when everyone said they couldn't." Elena felt something warm uncurl in her chest, something dangerously close to hope. She crushed it down immediately because hope had always been a liar before, but the warmth remained. "Spite is underrated," she said. "It's kept me alive more than once." "To spite, then." Silas raised an imaginary glass. "To spite," Elena agreed and smiled for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. By the 5th day, the snow had melted enough that they could move around the property without digging trenches first. Silas showed Elena the full extent of the ranch, the pastures, the water sources, the timber line where they could cut firewood, the high meadow where the grass grew thick in summer. It wasn't much land by frontier standards, just 200 acres carved out of the valley, but it was theirs. They were checking the cattle in the lower pasture when they heard the sound of horses approaching. Both of them tensed immediately. Visitors were rare, and surprise visitors were usually bad news. 3 riders came into view through the trees, moving at an easy pace that said they weren't worried about being welcome. Elena recognized 2 of them from the crowd in town. Amos Garrett and Curtis Webb. The third was a younger man she didn't know, but who had the same mean, small-minded look in his eyes. "Well, well," Garrett called out as they reined in. "Look at this, boys! The happy couple out for a stroll." Silas's hand tightened on his cane. "What do you want, Amos?" "Can a neighbor come calling? Thought we'd check on you after that storm. Make sure you two hadn't frozen to death out here." His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Though I suppose you've been keeping each other warm." The insinuation was clear and disgusting. Elena felt her face flush, not with embarrassment, but with rage. "We're fine," Silas said, his voice flat. "Thanks for your concern. You can leave now." Now that's not very hospitable. Webb leaned forward in his saddle, studying Elena like she was livestock at auction. "We haven't even met the new Mrs. Mercer properly. Heard you got yourself quite the bargain, Silas. Figured any woman desperate enough to marry you must be something special." "Watch your mouth," Silas said, and there was warning in his voice that made the younger man's hand drift toward his belt. "Or what?" Webb's smile widened. "You'll chase us off with that fancy stick of yours? We're just making conversation. No need to get hostile." Elena stepped forward before Silas could respond, putting herself slightly between him and the riders. It was instinctive. Protect the vulnerable point. Draw attention to yourself. Control the situation before it exploded. She'd learned those tactics surviving Thomas. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice carried the same cold authority she'd used to deflect her husband's rage. "My husband asked you to leave. If you have business here, state it. If not, you're trespassing." Garrett's smile faltered. There was something in Elena's bearing that didn't match the scarred face or the shabby dress, something that spoke of breeding and education and the kind of confidence that came from surviving worse than 3 small men on horses. "Trespassing," he repeated. "That's a big word for property line violation, yes." Elena's eyes were ice. "This is private land. You have no business here. Leave now, or I'll report you to the territorial marshal next time we're in town." "The marshal?" Webb laughed. "Lady, the marshal doesn't care about harassment, about threatening behavior, about 3 men cornering a married couple on their own property." Elena's voice never rose, but it cut like a blade. "I may be new to Wyoming, gentlemen, but I know the law, and I know that witnesses are very useful when filing complaints. My husband and I are both witnesses. Are you willing to test whether the marshal takes our word over yours? It was a bluff. The marshal probably wouldn't care, and even if he did, the word of a crippled rancher and a mail-order bride wouldn't carry much weight against established townsmen. But Elena delivered it with such absolute certainty that for a moment, doubt flickered across the men's faces. Silas caught on immediately. "My wife's right. You're welcome to test it, but I should mention that Mrs. Mercer's father is a federal prosecutor in Pennsylvania. She knows quite a bit about legal proceedings." Another lie, but a useful one. Elena's father had been a merchant who drank himself to death when she was 20, but the riders didn't know that. Garrett's face darkened. "This isn't over, Mercer. You think you can hide out here with your charity case wife, but everyone in town knows what you are. A failure, a cripple, a man who couldn't even— Enough!" Elena's voice cracked like a whip. "Get off our land. Now!" For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett spat in the snow, yanked his horse's head around, and kicked it into a trot. Webb and the younger man followed, throwing back looks that promised this wasn't finished. Elena and Silas stood watching until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did Elena let herself shake, adrenaline flooding through her system now that the immediate threat had passed. "Elena." Silas's hand touched her shoulder carefully, like she might break. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Are you?" "I should have—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I should have handled that." "You shouldn't have had to." "Had to what? Speak up?" She turned to face him. "Silas, I didn't do that because you're incapable. I did it because I'm good at it. I spent years managing my husband's moods, deflecting his anger, figuring out how to de-escalate violence before it started. Those are survival skills. I'm not ashamed of them. But they came here to humiliate me, and instead they left," Elena interrupted. "That's what matters. They left, and we're still standing, and they're the ones who look stupid." She paused, then added more gently, "We're partners, remember? That means we use whatever strengths we have. You're good at ranch work and animal handling and knowing this land. I'm good at reading people and using words like weapons. Together, we're stronger than either of us is alone. That's the point. He stared at her and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe? Or the beginning of respect. No one's ever... He stopped. Started again. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just remember that when I need you to return the favor. She managed a shaky smile. Now, can we please finish checking the cattle and get back inside? I'm freezing, and those men ruined my morning. They finished the work in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less uncertain. More solid. By the time they walked back to the house through snow that sparkled in the midday sun, something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had come down, replaced by the fragile beginning of trust. That night, after supper, Silas pulled out the ledger again, and they went over the numbers together, making plans for spring. Elena asked questions and made suggestions, and Silas listened instead of dismissing her ideas out of hand. They worked as a team, two damaged people building something that neither of them could have managed alone. And when Elena finally went to bed that night, she realized that for the first time since Thomas died, she wasn't just surviving, she was actually living. The difference terrified her. But maybe, she thought as she drifted towards sleep, maybe terror was better than numbness. Maybe feeling anything at all, even fear, meant there was still something left inside her worth saving. In the other room, Silas lay awake on his makeshift bed by the stove and thought about the way Elena had stood between him and three mounted men without hesitation. Thought about the steel in her voice and the intelligence in her eyes and the fact that she'd chosen to stand with him instead of letting him fall. He'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what partnership felt like. Now, lying in the dark while the fire died to embers and the house settled around him, he remembered. It felt like possibility. March came in like a predator, all teeth and claws. The first warm days of the month had fooled them into thinking winter might finally release its grip, but the valley had other plans. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday afternoon when Silas was in the barn and Elena was hanging laundry that would never dry. She saw the wall of white coming down from the mountains and ran for the house, her hips screaming protest with every jarring step. By the time she burst through the door, the wind was already tearing at the clothesline, whipping shirts and sheets into a frenzy of white fabric against white sky. "Silas!" she shouted toward the barn, but the wind swallowed her voice. She grabbed her coat and fought her way back outside, leaning into wind that tried to shove her backward. The barn was only 30 yards away, but it took her 5 minutes to reach it, and by the time she yanked open the door, her face was raw and her eyes were streaming. Silas was inside trying to calm the horses, who were stamping and rolling their eyes at the sudden violence of the storm. He looked up when she entered, and relief flashed across his face before he could hide it. "How bad?" he shouted over the wind. "Bad. Worst I've seen." Elena pushed the door shut and leaned against it, catching her breath. "We need to get back to the house." "The stock? We'll be fine in here. They've got shelter and hay. We don't." She grabbed his arm. "We go now or we don't go at all." He knew she was right. She could see him weighing options, calculating risks, hating the fact that his leg made everything harder. Finally, he nodded, and they pushed back out into what had become a complete whiteout in the 10 minutes since Elena had crossed the yard. They couldn't see the house. Couldn't see anything except snow driving horizontal, stinging exposed skin like thrown sand. Silas gripped Elena's hand, and she gripped his, and together they stumbled forward in what they hoped was the right direction. The wind shoved them sideways. Elena's bad leg nearly went out from under her twice, and the second time Silas caught her with strength she hadn't known he still had, hauling her upright and pulling her forward. Her hand hit wood. The house. She found the door handle by feel, and they fell inside together, slamming the door behind them against wind that tried to follow them in. They stood in the sudden relative quiet, gasping and dripping melted snow, neither speaking for a long moment. Then Silas started to laugh. Not humor, but something wilder, the sound of someone who'd just narrowly avoided death and couldn't quite believe it. 30 yards, he said. We almost died walking 30 goddamn yards. Elena sank into a chair, her legs shaking. How long will this last? Could be hours. Could be days. He moved to the window and scraped away frost, peering out at nothing. We can't check on the animals, can't do anything except wait it out. She heard what he didn't say, that if the storm lasted too long, the cattle might freeze in the open pasture, that the horses might panic and hurt themselves, that they could lose everything they'd been working toward in a single night of bad weather and worse luck. "Then we wait," she said. By nightfall, the temperature inside the house had dropped despite the stove burning hot enough to make the metal tick and groan. They pushed both beds into the main room, dragging them as close to the heat source as they dared, and piled every blanket they owned on top of them. The wind screamed around the corners of the house like something alive and furious. Snow found every gap, every crack, sifting in through spaces they'd thought were sealed and forming small drifts along the baseboards. Elena made supper from what they had: beans and the last of the salt pork, coffee that was more grounds than water because they were rationing. They ate in silence, both too tired and cold to bother with conversation. When the dishes were washed and put away, there was nothing left to do except huddle near the stove and try to stay warm. "Tell me something," Silas said suddenly. He was sitting on the floor with his back against his bed, his bad leg stretched out straight because bending it for too long made the pain worse. "Something from before. Something that doesn't hurt to remember." Elena pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She'd been avoiding the past for so long that reaching back for good memories felt like trying to find solid ground in a swamp. "My grandmother's farm," she said finally. "Summer afternoons when the work was done, and she'd let me take the old mare out to the creek. I'd sit in the shallows with my feet in the water and read whatever books I'd borrowed from the library in town. Terrible novels mostly, the kind where everyone was beautiful and noble and problems were solved by true love or sudden inheritances." "Sounds nice." It was. It was the last time I remember being happy without reservation, without waiting for something bad to happen. She paused. "I was 14. After that summer, my father sent me to the finishing school, and everything changed. I learned how to walk properly, speak properly, be proper, how to attract a suitable husband and manage a household, all the things that were supposed to make me valuable. Did it work? I married Thomas, didn't I? So yes, I suppose it worked exactly as intended." Her voice went flat. "I became exactly what I was supposed to become, and it nearly killed me." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "What was the first time he hit you?" Elena flinched. No one had ever asked her that directly. Most people danced around it or pretended it hadn't happened at all. 3 months after we married. He came home drunk and I'd made roast chicken for dinner, but it was cold by the time he arrived. He said I'd done it deliberately to embarrass him, that I was trying to make him look bad in front of—" She stopped. "No one was there. That's what made it so frightening. He was arguing with people who didn't exist. But when I tried to tell him that, he backhanded me across the face hard enough that I saw stars. Did you try to leave? Where would I go? My father was dead. My mother had remarried and moved to Boston with a man who'd made it clear I wasn't welcome. I had no money of my own. Everything belonged to Thomas. And who would believe me anyway? He was respected, successful. When he hit me, it was always in places that didn't show. When I had bruises on my face, he told people I'd fallen, that I was clumsy, that my limp made me unsteady." Her hands tightened on the blanket. "Eventually I started to believe maybe he was right. Maybe I was provoking him somehow. Maybe if I was just better, smarter, more careful. So stop." Silas's voice was rough. "None of that was your fault. You know that, right?" "I know it now. I didn't know it then." "When did you figure it out?" Elena thought back to that moment of clarity, the exact second when something inside her had shifted from self-blame to cold rage. "The night he pushed me down the stairs. I was lying there at the bottom with my hips screaming and blood running down my face from where I'd hit the nail, and he was standing at the top crying and apologizing, saying he loved me, saying he didn't mean it, saying it would never happen again. And I looked up at him and thought, he's going to kill me. Maybe not today, but eventually. And if I stay, I'm choosing that ending." "But you couldn't leave." "No, not then. I had 3 broken bones and no money and nowhere to go. So I stayed and I healed and I waited, and when the cholera came, I prayed." She caught herself. "Not to anything in particular, just to the universe, to fate, to whatever force decides who lives and who dies. I prayed that if there was any justice anywhere, it would take him and leave me. And it did. It did." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. 2 days of fever and convulsions, and then he was dead. The minister said it was a tragedy, that he'd been taken too soon, that his wife must be devastated. and I stood at the grave and felt nothing except relief so profound it was like being reborn. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows. The stove ticked. Silas reached over and added more wood, the firelight painting shadows across his face. "I'm glad he's dead," he said quietly. "I know that's a terrible thing to say, but I'm glad. And I'm glad you survived." Something broke loose in Elena's chest, some tight knot she'd been carrying for years. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever validated her relief, her anger, her right to be happy that her tormentor was gone. "Thank you," she managed. They sat in silence after that, listening to the storm rage. Eventually, Elena dozed, her head tipping forward onto her chest. She woke to Silas's hand on her shoulder, gentle but insistent. "Elena, you need to get under the blankets. It's too cold to sleep sitting up." She nodded groggily and crawled into the nest of quilts on her bed. Silas did the same on his, and they lay there in the firelight, both facing the stove, the space between their beds less than 3 feet. "Silas?" Elena's voice was heavy with sleep. "Yeah?" "What about you? What's something you remember that doesn't hurt?" He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, before the accident, before everything went wrong, there was this one morning, early summer, sun just coming up, and I took the Palomino out to check the high pasture. The grass was green, the sky was clear, and I could see all the way to the Wind River peaks. The mare was perfect under me, responding to every shift of my weight like we were one creature. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" "Every single day." His voice cracked slightly. "But even if I could, it wouldn't be the same. The accident didn't just break my leg. It broke whatever version of me existed before. That Silas Mercer died on that trail. I'm what's left." "You're not less than you were," Elena said fiercely. "You're different. That's not the same thing." "Tell that to my father. Tell that to everyone in Bitter Hollow who looks at me like I'm already a ghost. They're idiots who can't see past their own limitations. You're still here. You're still fighting. That counts for something." "Does it?" "Yes." She rolled over to face him, though in the dim light she could barely make out his silhouette. "It counts for everything, because giving up would be easy. Staying is the hard part. And you stayed. So did you. So did I," she agreed. "Maybe that makes us both stubborn. Or maybe it just makes us survivors." "Survivors," Silas repeated, testing the word. "I like that better than victims." "Me too." The storm intensified during the night, temperatures plummeting so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows, and their breath came out in visible clouds even 3 feet from the stove. Elena woke shivering violently around what might have been 2 in the morning, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Across the narrow gap, she heard Silas moving. "Elena, you all right?" "Cold," she managed through chattering teeth. She heard him swear quietly, then the sound of blankets being moved. "We need to share heat. This is survival, I'm not trying to—" "I know." She pushed back her own blankets. "Help me move the beds together." They managed it despite shaking hands and aching joints, pushing the 2 narrow beds flush against each other. Then they piled every blanket they had on top and crawled underneath, lying back to back at first because that seemed safer, more appropriate. But appropriate didn't matter when you were freezing to death. After 10 minutes of continued shivering, Elena rolled over and pressed against Silas's back, wrapping one arm around his middle and burying her face between his shoulder blades. She felt him tense, then deliberately relax. "This all right?" she whispered. "Yeah." His voice was rough. "Yeah, this is fine." The warmth between them built slowly, their combined body heat trapped under the layers of quilts, creating a pocket of something almost bearable. Elena's shivering gradually subsided. She felt Silas's breathing even out, felt some of the tension leave his frame. "Elena?" "Hmm?" "I'm sorry you had to go through what you went through with Thomas. No one should have to survive that. I'm sorry about your father, and your fiancé, and everyone who made you feel like you weren't worth their time." His hand found hers under the blankets and squeezed once. "We're a pair, aren't we? Just collecting damage and carrying it around. At least we're carrying it together now." "Yeah." His thumb traced across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her throat tight. "Together." Elena closed her eyes and let herself sink into the warmth, into the unexpected comfort of another human being who understood what it meant to survive something that should have destroyed you. The storm raged on outside, but here, in this fragile pocket of heat and trust, something was shifting between them. Something that might have been dangerous if either of them had been looking for romance or rescue. But they weren't. They were just two broken people trying to make it through the night, and there was an honesty in that which felt more real than any poetry about love at first sight. She fell asleep with Silas's heartbeat steady against her palm and dreamed of summer mornings and creek water and the particular quality of happiness that came from surviving another day. By morning, the storm had blown itself out. They woke tangled together in a way that should have been awkward but somehow wasn't, and separated with careful politeness that acknowledged what had happened without making it into something bigger than survival. The house was arctic, despite the stove's valiant efforts, and their first priority was getting it warm enough to think straight. Silas fed the stove while Elena melted snow for coffee. When they finally had hot drinks in their hands and feeling returning to their fingers and toes, they looked at each other across the table and started laughing. Not polite chuckles, but real laughter, the kind that came from relief and exhaustion and the sheer absurdity of nearly freezing to death in their own home. "We have to check on the animals," Silas said when they'd recovered, "if they survived the night." They bundled up and fought their way through drifts that came up past Elena's knees, using shovels to break a path to the barn. Inside, the stock were cold and hungry, but alive. The horses nickered when they saw Silas, and the milk cow mooed indignantly about the late breakfast service. "They made it," Elena said, feeling relief wash through her. "They all made it. Now we see about the cattle." Silas's face was grim. They were caught in the open when this hit. They found them in a cluster at the fence line, huddled together for warmth with their backs to the wind. 2 were down, frozen solid. The rest were on their feet but weak, struggling through the snow toward the sound of Silas's voice calling them. 12 left, Silas said, his voice carefully empty. Down from 14. Elena did the math in her head. At $20 per head, they'd just lost $40. More than a month's worth of mortgage payments. She looked at Silas's face and saw him doing the same calculation, saw the defeat starting to creep in. "We still have 12, she said firmly. "That's enough for the drive. We can do this. If we lose more between now and April, we won't. We'll move them closer to the barn, keep them where we can watch them." She grabbed his arm, making him look at her. "Silas, we can do this. Don't give up now." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw him struggling with something internal, the same despair that had been eating at him for 3 years, the voice that said he was cursed and broken, and everything he touched would fail. Then something hardened in his expression, and he nodded. "All right, we move them today. Get them into the lower pasture where there's more shelter." They spent the rest of the day doing exactly that, driving the reluctant cattle through deep snow and into a paddock near enough to the barn that they could be fed and watched easily. It was exhausting work that left both of them limping worse than usual, but by sunset the job was done and the cattle were safe. That night, Elena made stew from supplies that were running dangerously low, and they ate in silence, too tired for conversation. The beds were still pushed together from the night before, and neither of them suggested separating them. When they finally crawled under the blankets, Elena curled against Silas's back again, and he reached back to rest his hand on her hip, casual, comfortable, the kind of touch that said, "You're here, and I'm here, and that's enough." "Elena? Thank you for not giving up on me. On this place. Thank you for giving me a reason not to." His fingers tightened slightly on her hip. "I was serious, about trying to make this work. Not just the ranch, this, us, whatever this is turning into." Elena felt her heart kick against her ribs. "I'm not good at this. At trusting people. At letting anyone close. Neither am I. What if we ruin it? What if we hurt each other? Then we do." Silas rolled over to face her, and in the dim light from the dying fire she could see his eyes were serious. "But I'd rather risk it than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." "That's not practical." "No, but for once, I don't care about practical. I care about—" He stopped. Started again. "I care about you. However this happened, whatever we thought this arrangement would be, I care about you. And I think maybe you care about me too." Elena's throat was tight. I do. But carrying isn't safe. Carrying is how you get hurt. I know. His hand came up to touch her face, his fingers gentle on her scarred cheek. But maybe hurt is the price of being alive instead of just surviving. Maybe it's worth it. She wanted to argue. Wanted to explain all the reasons this was a terrible idea, why keeping distance and walls between them was the smart choice. But his hand was warm on her face and his eyes were looking at her like she was something precious instead of something broken, and all the reasonable arguments dried up in her throat. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. What if this makes everything worse? What if it makes everything better? Elena closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Tears she hadn't allowed herself in years because crying was weakness, and weakness got you hurt. But Silas's thumb was wiping them away with such gentleness that it made her cry harder. All the fear and grief and desperate hope she'd been holding in coming out in ugly, choking sobs. He pulled her close and held her while she fell apart, his hand steady on her back, his voice murmuring meaningless comfort into her hair. And when she finally cried herself out and lay exhausted against his chest, he didn't let go, just held her in the darkness while the fire died to embers and the house creaked around them. We'll figure it out, he said quietly. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, we'll figure it out together. That's all we can do. Elena nodded against his chest, too wrung out to speak. But her hand found his in the darkness and held on tight, and Silas held back just as fiercely. Outside, the stars came out over a landscape scrubbed clean by the storm. The mountains stood silent and eternal against the night sky. And in the small house at the edge of nowhere, two damaged people held each other and chose to believe, just for tonight, that survival might be enough to build something worth keeping. The morning after their confession brought no dramatic transformation, no sudden shift into something easier. They woke tangled together and separated with the same careful politeness as before, though Silas's hand lingered on Elena's shoulder a moment longer than necessary, and she let it. The work still needed doing, the cattle still needed feeding, the fence line still sagged under the weight of winter damage. But something had changed in the space between them, something that made the isolation feel less like punishment and more like sanctuary. April came slowly, the snow melting in patches that turned the valley into a patchwork of mud and slush and stubborn white. They worked side by side repairing fence, Elena holding posts steady while Silas hammered, both of them learning to compensate for the other's limitations without making it obvious. When Silas's leg gave out halfway through stringing wire, Elena simply took over the task while he sat on a stump and directed. When Elena's hip locked up after too many hours of bending and lifting, Silas finished the work and said nothing about it. They were becoming a unit, learning each other's rhythms the way draft horses learn to pull together. It wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. They were too tired and sore most nights for anything beyond collapsing into bed, but there was an intimacy in it that ran deeper than desire. They knew each other's pain thresholds, knew when to push and when to back off, knew the difference between stubborn pride and genuine inability. We should start planning the drive, Silas said one evening in mid-April, the ledger open between them on the table. Weather's holding. Another 2 weeks and the pass should be clear enough. Elena studied the rough map he'd sketched, tracing the route with one finger. 40 miles in 3 days means we're covering 14 miles a day. Can the cattle handle that pace? If we start early and don't push them too hard during the heat of the day, the trick is finding good places to bed them down at night where they won't scatter. He tapped the map. There's a meadow here, about 15 miles out. Good water, natural enclosure. That's our first night. Second night, we camp near the timberline. There's a box canyon that'll hold them. Third day, we push straight through to the railhead. And if something goes wrong, then we adapt. He looked at her steadily. I won't lie to you, Elena. This is risky. Weather could turn. The cattle could spook. One of us could get hurt. But staying here and slowly going broke is guaranteed failure. At least this way, we're taking action. She nodded slowly, thinking through contingencies. We'll need supplies, food for 3 days, medical kit, extra rope, and we should scout the first stretch of the route before we commit. Agreed, we can ride out tomorrow, check the condition of the trail. He paused, then added quietly, I'll need to get back on a horse for real. Not just around the property, and that means you'll see how bad it is, how much I struggle with it. Silas. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. I've seen you struggle with stairs. I've seen you fall in the snow. I've watched you push through pain that would put most men flat on their backs. Whatever happens with the horse, it's not going to change how I see you. How do you see me? As someone who doesn't quit. She squeezed his hand once and let go. Now finish your coffee and let's get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. They rode out at dawn, Silas on the steadiest of the three horses, and Elena on a gray mare that had a gentle gait. Watching Silas mount was difficult. It took him 3 tries and left him white-faced and sweating. But once he was in the saddle, some of the tension left his shoulders. His leg hung at an awkward angle, and Elena could see him favoring it, but he sat straight and handled the reins with competence. You're better than you think, she said as they started up the trail. I'm worse than I was. That's all I can see. Then you're looking at the wrong thing. Stop comparing yourself to who you were and start looking at who you are now. He gave her a look that was half annoyance, half reluctant amusement. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I just know what it's like to hate yourself for not being what you used to be. Elena urged her mare forward. Took me 2 years to stop feeling like a failure every time my hip gave out. Sometimes I still do. But mostly I've learned that survival is its own kind of success. They followed the trail up through pine forest that smelled of sap and damp earth, the horses picking their way carefully over rocks and deadfall. The route was rougher than Elena had expected, with steep sections that would be challenging for cattle, but nothing impossible. After 3 hours, they emerged onto a high meadow, exactly where Silas had marked it on his map. This is it, he said, dismounting with barely concealed relief. First night's camp. Elena slid down from her mare and walked the perimeter of the meadow. It was perfect. About 5 acres of flat ground with good grass coming in, a creek running along one edge, and natural barriers of rock and timber on 3 sides. Only one way in or out, which meant the cattle couldn't scatter easily. It'll work, she said. What about water for the second night? Small lake about a mile off the main trail. We'll have to detour, but it's worth it. Better than trying to camp where there's no water at all. They ate lunch sitting on sun-warmed rocks while the horses grazed, sharing bread and cheese and dried apples that were mostly wrinkled but still edible. The valley spread out below them, Bitter Hollow a smudge of buildings in the distance. Their own ranch invisible from this height, but they're somewhere in the folds of land. It's beautiful up here, Elena said. Lonely, but beautiful. That's Wyoming, beautiful and harsh, and it doesn't give a damn if you make it or not. Silas took a drink from his canteen. Sometimes I think that's why I stayed. Everything else in my life fell apart, but the land was still here. Still the same as it was when I was a kid. That felt important somehow. Do you still love it, or do you just love what it used to mean to you? He thought about that for a long moment. Both, maybe. Or neither. Mostly I just couldn't stand the thought of letting my father be right about me, of proving that I really was useless without the ranch. He looked at her. What about you? Do you think you'll stay here after whatever happens with us? Where else would I go? Elena pulled her knees up to her chest. Pennsylvania is where Thomas is buried and where everyone remembers me as his wife. I have no family left that wants me. No money except what I earn here. And honestly, I don't want to go back to cities and crowds and people who think they know better than you what your life should look like. So you're staying out of lack of options? No. She turned to look at him directly. I'm staying because for the first time in my adult life, I'm building something that's mine. Not my father's, not my husband's. Mine. Ours, if we're being accurate. And I'm not walking away from that unless you force me to. Silas's expression softened. I'm not going to force you anywhere. You know that. I do now. She smiled slightly. 2 months ago, I wasn't sure. You could have been another Thomas, just better at hiding it. But you're not. You get angry and frustrated, and sometimes you're stubborn as hell, but you've never once tried to control me or make me small. That's worth more than you probably realize. Elena. He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. I'm not good at this, at saying what I feel, but you should know that you matter. To me. This place matters more because you're in it, and if this cattle drive succeeds, it's going to be because of you as much as me. She felt warmth spread through her chest, something dangerous and precious that she'd been trying not to name. We matter to each other. That's the point. We're a team now. Best damn team in Wyoming, Silas said, and the grin that crossed his face made him look younger, less burdened. Even if we're also the most broken. They rode back to the ranch as the sun started its descent, both of them more confident about the upcoming drive and more uncertain about everything else. That night, lying in bed with Silas's arm around her and her head on his shoulder, Elena realized she'd stopped thinking of this as temporary. Somewhere along the line, the arrangement had become something real. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. They sorted the cattle, culling the weakest and keeping the 12 most likely to survive the drive. They gathered supplies, mended tack, packed and repacked saddlebags until they had the absolute minimum they'd need and nothing extra. Elena practiced with the lasso until her hands were rope-burned and raw, learning to throw a loop that would actually catch something. Silas drilled her on handling spooked cattle, teaching her to read the signs of a pending stampede and how to turn the leaders without getting trampled. If they bolt, don't try to stop them head-on, he instructed, watching her work a practice dummy made of logs and old grain sacks. Ride alongside the leaders and turn them in a circle. They'll run themselves out eventually. The important thing is not to panic and not to get in front of them. What if I can't keep up? Then let them go and we'll find them later. Losing cattle is bad. Getting yourself killed is worse. She looked at him sharply. Same goes for you. My leg's not going to let me chase down anything faster than a limping cow. You're the real rider here. I'm competent. You're experienced. Don't sell yourself short just because you can't do everything you used to. Elena threw the lasso again, this time catching the dummy clean around the neck. See? I'm learning. You can learn to work with the leg instead of against it. Silas shook his head, but he was smiling. You're relentless, you know that? I'm practical. There's a difference. 3 days before they planned to leave, Elena woke with a strange flutter in her stomach. She ignored it, pushing through morning chores and breakfast preparation, but the feeling persisted, an odd sort of rolling sensation that was both familiar and impossible. It wasn't until she was bent over the wash basin, suddenly nauseous without reason, that understanding hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant. Elena gripped the edge of the basin, her mind racing through calculations. She'd been at the ranch for nearly 3 months. Her monthly courses had been irregular since Thomas died, stress, the doctor had said, so she hadn't thought much of missing 1 or even 2. But 3, combined with this morning sickness and the tenderness in her breast she'd attributed to hard physical labor, added up to something that should have been impossible. She and Silas had been sharing a bed for over a month now, pressed together for warmth that had gradually turned into something more. They'd been careful, or as careful as 2 people who'd both been married before could be, but careful wasn't the same as safe. The timing was catastrophic. 3 days before a cattle drive that would require every ounce of physical strength and endurance she possessed, with their financial survival hanging on successful completion of this trip, with everything they'd built together depending on both of them pulling their weight. She couldn't tell him, not now, not when he was finally starting to believe they could make this work. The news would either make him cancel the drive, which would doom them financially, or make him worry himself sick during the journey. Either way, it would ruin their chances. Elena straightened up, splashed cold water on her face, and made a decision. She would do the drive. She would keep the pregnancy to herself until they were back and the cattle were sold and they had money in the bank. Then she would tell Silas and they would figure out what came next. It was lying by omission, which she hated, but it was also survival, which she understood perfectly. "You all right?" Silas asked when she came back to the main room. He was packing the last of their supplies into saddlebags, organizing everything with the precision of someone who'd made this kind of trip before. "Fine. Just tired." Not entirely a lie. The exhaustion that had been creeping up on her made sudden sense now. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we're going to be." He straightened, looking at her with concern. "Elena, if you're not feeling up to this..." "I'm fine," she said firmly. "Stop worrying. We've planned this. We've prepared. Tomorrow morning we leave, and 3 days from now we'll have enough money to pay the mortgage and keep this place running. That's what matters." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, but if at any point during the drive you need to stop, you tell me. Pride isn't worth getting hurt over." "Same goes for you." "Deal." That night, lying in Silas's arms, Elena felt guilt twist in her stomach, alongside the child that was growing there. She was keeping a secret that affected both of them, making a unilateral decision about their future in the same way Thomas had made decisions for her. The parallel made her sick. But this was different, she told herself. She wasn't controlling Silas, she was protecting him, protecting them both, giving them a chance to succeed before adding this new complication to the mix. She fell asleep trying to believe that, and dreamed of being lost in a snowstorm, calling out for help that never came. They moved out at first light, 12 head of cattle and 2 riders who had no business attempting something this ambitious. Silas rode point, using his voice and presence to keep the cattle moving forward. Elena rode flank, circling back and forth to collect stragglers and turn away any that tried to break from the group. The first day went better than expected. The cattle were calm, the weather held, and by late afternoon they reached the meadow campsite with only minor incidents. They bedded down the herd, made a simple camp, and ate beans heated over a fire that seemed to smoke more than it burned. "Not bad for amateurs," Silas said, stretching out his bad leg toward the fire with a grimace. "We might actually pull this off." Elena didn't answer. She was fighting waves of nausea that the smell of the beans had triggered, trying to keep her face neutral and her stomach under control. When Silas wasn't looking, she poured most of her food back into the pot and covered it with dirt. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steadily, and the cattle balked at the steeper sections. Elena spent hours riding back and forth, pushing reluctant animals forward, her hips screaming protest with every jarring step of the horse. By the time they stopped for the night at the lake, Silas had mentioned she was so exhausted she could barely dismount. "You overdid it," Silas said, helping her down from the mare. "I should have taken more of the—" "I'm fine." Elena pulled away from him, hating how sharp her voice sounded. "I just need to rest. We both do." She walked to the edge of the lake and sat down heavily, her hands shaking with fatigue and low blood sugar, and the effort of keeping up the pretense that everything was normal. Behind her, she heard Silas moving around camp, settling the horses, checking the cattle, taking care of everything because that's what he did, even when his own body was falling apart. Guilt crashed over her again, stronger this time. She should tell him. He deserved to know. They were partners, and partners didn't keep secrets this big. But the words wouldn't come, because if she told him now, in the middle of the drive with no way back and no way forward except through, it would only make everything harder. Better to wait. Just 2 more days? Then she'd tell him everything and deal with whatever came after. Elena pressed her hands against her stomach, still flat, still showing no sign of the life taking root inside, and made a silent promise to the child she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure she wanted. "I will get us through this. I will keep us safe, even if it means lying to the one person who matters most." The third day dawned gray and threatening, with clouds building over the mountains that promised rain by afternoon. They broke camp quickly and pushed the cattle hard, trying to cover the last stretch before weather made the trail impassable. Around noon, the lead steer decided it had had enough and broke for the timber. 2 others followed before Elena could react, and suddenly she was riding flat out through pine forest, dodging low branches and trying to get ahead of the runaways without breaking her neck in the process. She managed to turn them, barely, and was herding them back toward the main group when her mare stepped in a hidden wash and went down. Elena had just enough time to kick free of the stirrups before she hit the ground hard, her bad hip taking the brunt of the impact. Pain exploded up her spine. She lay there for a moment, gasping, taking inventory of what hurt and what was broken. The hip was bad, but probably not fractured. Her shoulder had clipped a rock and was going to bruise spectacularly, and there was a sharp ache in her lower abdomen that made terror ice through her veins because she knew what that meant. "Elena!" Silas was off his horse and limping toward her as fast as he could move. Don't try to get up yet. Where are you hurt?" "I'm fine." She struggled to sit up despite his protests, testing each limb. Everything worked. Nothing was broken. But the cramping in her stomach was getting worse, and when she shifted position, she felt something wet between her legs that wasn't sweat or mud. No, not now, not here." "Elena, you're pale as death. What's wrong?" Silas crouched beside her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Talk to me." She opened her mouth to lie again, to say it was nothing, to push through and finish this damn drive because they were so close. But the pain intensified and the wetness increased, and suddenly all the secrets and lies came spilling out in a rush of words she couldn't control. "I'm pregnant. Or I was. I think—" Her voice cracked. I think I'm losing it. I'm sorry. I should have told you, but we needed to do this drive and I thought I could make it, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The look on Silas's face was pure shock, but it lasted only a second before shifting to determination. How far along? 2 months, maybe, I'm not sure. And you've been doing this drive, riding for 3 days, pushing yourself. He stopped, his jaw working. We're getting you to a doctor, now. The cattle? Forget the cattle. His voice was hard. You think I care about 12 head of livestock more than I care about you? We're turning around right now. Silas, we're less than 10 miles from the railhead. We can make it. I can make it. No. He stood up, wincing as his bad leg took his weight. You can't, and I won't risk you trying. End of discussion. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to explain that they needed the money too desperately to give up now, but another cramp doubled her over and she had to admit defeat. He was right. She couldn't make it, and pushing forward would risk not just the pregnancy but her own life. What about the cattle? She managed. I'll drive them back to the ranch. You're riding straight to town. He was already moving, catching her mare and checking it for injury. The horse is sound. Can you ride if I help you mount? Think so. Getting into the saddle was agony, but she managed it with Silas's help. He gave her the canteen and what was left of their food, and pointed her toward a trail that would take her directly to Bitter Hollow, while he and the cattle took the longer route back. You ride straight through, he instructed. Don't stop except to rest the horse. Get to Doc Harrison and tell him whatever you need to. I'll be there as soon as I can. Silas, she reached down and gripped his hand. I'm sorry. I should have told you. We'll talk about that later. Right now you need to go. But his hand squeezed hers once, hard, and his eyes were full of something that might have been fear, or might have been love, or might have been both. Stay alive, Elena. Whatever happens with the baby, you stay alive. Promise me. I promise. She turned the mare toward town and kicked it into a trot, leaving Silas standing alone with 12 cattle and the ruins of their plan. The cramping got worse as she rode, and she could feel blood soaking through her clothes, but she kept the mare moving forward because she'd made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Elena had survived Thomas. She'd survived poverty and loneliness and 3 months of Wyoming winter. She would survive this too, even if survival meant losing the child she hadn't known she wanted until it was being taken away. The miles blurred together, pain and fear and exhaustion mixing into a gray haze. When Bitter Hollow finally came into view, Elena was barely conscious, slumped forward in the saddle with her arms around the mare's neck and tears streaming down her face. She'd made it. Whether that was triumph or tragedy, she'd made it. And somewhere behind her, Silas was driving their cattle home alone, knowing everything now, carrying all the weight of their shared secrets and uncertain future. They would survive this. They had to, because the alternative was giving up, and neither of them knew how to do that anymore. Doc Harrison smelled like whiskey and carbolic acid when he caught Elena as she slid off the mare in front of his office. She barely remembered the next few hours. Just fragments of pain and voices, and the doctor's rough hands examining her while she stared at water stains on the ceiling and tried not to scream. When she finally surfaced from the fog of laudanum and exhaustion, it was dark outside, and someone was sitting in a chair beside the bed. Not Silas. A woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged and competent-looking, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Easy, the woman said when Elena tried to sit up. You've had a rough go of it. I'm Martha Harrison, the doctor's wife. He asked me to sit with you while he went to check on another patient. The baby? Elena's voice came out as a whisper. Martha's face told her everything before the words did. I'm sorry, dear, you lost it. Maybe 6, 7 weeks along by the doctor's estimation. These things happen, especially with the kind of strain you were under. Your body just couldn't hold on. Elena closed her eyes against the tears that came without permission. She'd known. Had felt it happening during that long ride to town. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. The child had been unplanned, unwanted even, but somewhere during those 3 days of pushing cattle through mountain passes, she'd started to imagine a future that included a baby, a family, something permanent and good growing out of the wreckage of their broken lives. My husband, she managed. Silas, is he? He arrived about 2 hours ago with a herd of cattle and a look on his face that could freeze hell solid. Martha's voice was gentle. He's outside arguing with the doctor about being allowed to see you. Between you and me, I think Doc's just giving you time to wake up proper before letting that man in here. He was in a state. I need to see him. And you will. But first, you need to know what Doc Harrison said. You're going to be fine physically. There was bleeding, but it stopped on its own, and there's no sign of infection. You'll need to rest for a few weeks. Take it easy. Let your body heal. And Martha paused, her expression careful. Doc says there's no reason you can't carry another child to term when you're ready. This wasn't your fault, Mrs. Mercer. Sometimes nature just decides it's not the right time. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After a moment, Martha stood and moved toward the door. I'll send your husband in. And Mrs. Mercer? He loves you. That much is clear as day. Whatever you two are dealing with, you'll figure it out together. The door opened and Silas came through it like a man walking into a room where he expected bad news. His clothes were filthy, his face was drawn with exhaustion, and his limp was pronounced enough that he needed his cane to cross the 10 feet to her bedside. But when his eyes met hers, the relief in them was so profound it made her chest ache. You're all right, he said. Not a question, a statement, like he was trying to convince himself. I'm all right, the baby… I know. He sank into the chair Martha had vacated, his bad legs stretched out in front of him. Doc told me, I'm sorry, Elena, I'm so damn sorry. It's my fault. I pushed too hard. I knew I was pregnant and I did the drive anyway and… Stop. His voice was firm. This isn't your fault. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine for not noticing something was wrong. For not… He stopped, rubbing his face with both hands. You should have told me. We could have postponed the drive, found another way. There was no other way. We needed the money. We needed you alive more than we needed money. The simple certainty in his voice broke something loose in Elena's chest. She started to cry, ugly, wrenching sobs that hurt her bruised ribs and made her whole body shake. Silas moved from the chair to the edge of the bed, gathering her carefully into his arms and holding her while she fell apart. I wanted it, she choked out between sobs. I didn't think I did, but when I realized I was losing it, I wanted it so badly. A baby, our baby, something good and new, and I know. His hand was steady on her back, his voice rough with emotion he was barely keeping contained. I know, I wanted it too, didn't realize how much until Doc told me it was gone. They held each other in that small rented room while darkness settled over Bitter Hollow and the rest of the world moved on without them. Outside, someone was shouting about cattle in the street. A dog barked. Normal life continuing as if their small tragedy mattered to anyone but them. Eventually, Elena's tears ran out and she pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her hand. What happened with the cattle? Did you get them back to the ranch? Silas's expression went complicated. Not exactly. I got them here to town and sold them. You what? I sold them to Patterson at the feed store. He's got a contract with the railroad and he gave me $18 a head. It's not the $20 we would have gotten at the railhead, but it's $216, which is enough to pay the mortgage and keep us going through summer. Elena stared at him. You were supposed to take them back to the ranch. I told you. You told me a lot of things that turned out to be based on you thinking you had to handle everything alone. His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. I made a decision. We needed the money, the cattle were here, and I wasn't about to drive them another 40 miles when my wife was lying in a doctor's office bleeding. So I sold them. If you want to be angry about that, fine, but I'd make the same choice again. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Because he was right. She had been trying to handle everything alone, making decisions unilaterally because that's what survival had taught her. But survival and partnership were different things, and she was still learning the difference. I'm not angry, she said finally. I don't know what I am. Relieved, maybe, that you were practical about it, that we're not completely ruined. We're not ruined. We're actually in better shape than we've been in months. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Paid off 3 months of mortgage arrears and put the rest in the bank. We've got breathing room now. Time to rebuild the herd, fix up the property, maybe even hire help for the heavy work. Hire help with what money? With the money we'll make selling horses. I've been thinking about this. The cattle market is unreliable, but good working horses always sell. We've got 3 decent mares. If I can buy or trade for a quality stallion, we could start breeding them. Build up a string over the next few years. Elena looked at him, this man who'd been beaten down by life and circumstance but was still making plans for the future, still believing they had a future worth planning for. That could work, she said slowly, but it'll take time, years probably. We've got years. At least I hope we do. He took her hand carefully, like he was afraid she might pull away. Elena, when I thought I might lose you today, when I saw you ride out and didn't know if you'd make it to town, I realized something. The ranch doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. Nothing matters if you're not there, and I know that's not practical or reasonable, but it's true. Silas, let me finish. I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between you showing up in that snow and you facing down Amos Garrett and you pushing me to try things I thought I couldn't do anymore, I fell in love with you. And I'm telling you now because life's too short and too hard to waste time pretending we're just business partners. Elena felt her throat tighten. I love you too. I think I have for weeks, but I was too scared to say it. Too scared that admitting it would mean losing it. We might lose it anyway. We might lose everything. That's how life works. Silas's thumb traced circles on her palm. But I'd rather have whatever time we get than spend another minute lying about what this is between us. So what is it? A marriage. A real one. Not an arrangement or a contract, but two people who chose each other and keep choosing each other even when it's hard. He paused. If that's what you want. It's what I want. Elena squeezed his hand. It's what I've wanted since the night of the blizzard when you held me and I realized I wasn't afraid. Not of you, not of this, just afraid of losing it. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, both of them too wrung out for grand gestures, but feeling the weight of the commitment they'd just made. It wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. They were in a rented room that smelled like medicine, both of them battered and exhausted and grieving a child they'd never meet. But it was real in a way that mattered more than romance. Doc says I need to rest for a few weeks, Elena said finally. I can't go back to the ranch yet. Too much risk of bleeding starting again. Then we'll stay in town. I already rented a room at the boarding house. At her look, he added, with the money from the cattle, we can afford it. What about the animals at the ranch? I paid Jimmy Patterson's boy to go out twice a day and handle the feeding. Cost me $2 for the week, but it's worth it to know everything's taken care of. Silas stood carefully, favoring his leg. Right now you need to sleep. Real sleep, not the kind where you're worrying about everything falling apart. I'll be here when you wake up. You need rest too. I'll rest. But I'm not leaving you alone in this room, so get comfortable with the idea of me sleeping in that chair, because that's what's happening. Elena wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. At least get a blanket from Mrs. Harrison. I will. Now sleep. She closed her eyes, feeling the laudanum the doctor had given her pulling her down into darkness. The last thing she remembered was Silas's hand still holding hers, warm and steady and solid as bedrock. The week they spent in Bitter Hollow changed something fundamental. Word got around about what had happened, small towns being what they were, and the response surprised them both. Mrs. Patterson from the general store brought food. Martha Harrison checked on Elena daily, refusing payment and offering quiet companionship instead. Even the banker, a stern man named Caldwell, who'd been threatening foreclosure for months, stopped by to say the mortgage payments had been received and to wish them well. People aren't as heartless as they pretend, Martha said one afternoon, sitting with Elena while Silas was out dealing with ranch business. Most folks around here respect someone who fights for what they've got. You and your husband have been fighting. That counts for something. They laughed at us when I first arrived, called us a matched pair, like we were freaks. People laugh at what they don't understand. And they didn't understand how two broken people could make something work when everyone expected you to fail. Martha smiled slightly. But you did make it work. And that makes them uncomfortable because it means they don't have excuses anymore for their own failures. Elena thought about that after Martha left, about how much of human cruelty came from fear and discomfort with anything that challenged the accepted order of things. She and Silas had refused to stay in the boxes the world had built for them. The crippled rancher who should give up, the scarred widow who should be grateful for any attention. They built something else instead, something that didn't fit neatly into anyone's expectations. Maybe that was the real victory. Not surviving, but refusing to let survival be the ceiling of what they could achieve. By the end of the week, Elena was strong enough to ride back to the ranch. Silas had bought a proper wagon seat cushion with some of the cattle money, and the journey was easier than the one that had brought her to Wyoming 3 months earlier. When the house came into view across the valley, Elena felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "Home," she said. Silas looked at her, his expression soft. "Yeah, home." The spring months that followed were the hardest and best of Elena's life. They rebuilt the ranch slowly, one fence post and one repaired roof shingle at a time. Silas traded 2 steers and $50 for a young stallion with good bloodlines, and they began the long process of breeding horses. Elena planted a kitchen garden, coaxing vegetables from soil that hadn't seen cultivation in years. They worked from sunup to sundown and fell into bed exhausted. But it was the exhaustion of building something rather than just surviving. The grief over the lost pregnancy came in waves. Some days Elena would be fine, and other days she'd see a woman in town with a baby and have to turn away before the tears came. Silas handled his own grief quietly, but she'd catch him sometimes staring at nothing with an expression that said he was thinking about what might have been. They didn't talk about trying again. Not yet. The unspoken agreement was that they'd let Elena's body heal, let the ranch stabilize, let themselves process what had happened before making decisions about the future. Summer arrived with heat that baked the valley and turned the grass golden. The first foal was born in July, a leggy filly with her mother's gentle temperament and her father's strong build. Silas spent hours working with her, teaching her to accept a halter and lead, moving with a patience that Elena hadn't seen before. "You're good with her," she said one evening, watching him work the filly in the corral. "Horses don't care if you limp. They just care if you're consistent and fair." He ran his hand down the filly's neck. "It's restful, working with something that doesn't judge you. People judge because they're afraid. Horses are smarter than that." He smiled at that, and Elena realized how much more often he smiled now than he had when she first arrived. The bitter edge that had defined him was softening, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. In August, Elena woke one morning and realized her monthly courses were late again. She said nothing for 2 weeks, afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it by speaking the possibility aloud. But when the nausea started and her breasts became tender, she couldn't deny it anymore. She was pregnant again. This time, she told Silas immediately. They were sitting at the table after supper, the lamp burning low between them, when she reached across and took his hand. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. His face went through 6 expressions in the space of a second: shock, fear, hope, caution. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming it, but all the signs are there." "How far along?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. Early still. She tightened her grip on his hand. "I'm scared, Silas. After what happened last time, we'll be careful. No cattle drives, no heavy lifting, nothing that puts you at risk. We hire help if we need to, whatever it takes." His voice was fierce. "And if it doesn't work out again, we'll survive that too. Together. I want this baby. I want our family." "So do I." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "So we do everything right this time. We take no chances. Agreed?" "Agreed." The pregnancy progressed slowly through fall. Elena moved carefully, rested often, let Silas take on more of the physical work while she handled the accounts and planning. Dr. Harrison checked on her monthly, pronouncing everything normal and healthy, but warning her to take no risks. "Your body's been through trauma," he said during the October visit, "both from your first husband's abuse and from the miscarriage. You're at higher risk for complications. That means bed rest if I say so, and no arguing." "I understand." "Do you? Because Mrs. Mercer, I've seen women like you before. Tough, competent, used to pushing through pain and doing what needs doing. But pregnancy isn't something you can muscle through on determination alone. You need to rest. You need to let people help you. Can you do that?" Elena looked at Silas, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed and his expression worried. "I can try." "Try isn't good enough. Either you rest or you risk losing this child and possibly your own life. Those are the stakes." She swallowed hard. "Then I'll rest, whatever it takes." Winter came early that year, snow arriving in November and staying through December. Elena spent her days by the stove, knitting baby clothes from wool she'd carded and spun herself, reading books Silas brought from town, and trying not to go crazy with the forced inactivity. Silas handled everything outside: the animals, the heavy work, the constant battle against weather and isolation, and came in each evening exhausted but determined not to show it. "You're doing too much," Elena said one night in January, watching him lower himself into a chair with a barely suppressed groan. "I'm doing what needs doing. You're limping worse than when I first met you. Your leg can't take this strain. My leg will hold out until spring. After that, we'll hire someone to help with the heavy work." He reached over and placed his hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby move under his palm. "Right now, all that matters is keeping you and this child safe. The ranch can wait." Elena covered his hand with hers, feeling the life moving inside her, strong kicks and rolls that said this baby was fighter. "I think we're going to make it this time. I can feel it. I hope you're right. But even if something goes wrong, we'll survive it. We're good at surviving. I'm tired of just surviving. I want to live, really live, without fear or grief or waiting for the next disaster." "Then that's what we'll do." Silas leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "We'll live. We'll build something good here. And we'll prove to everyone who doubted us that broken people can heal each other." The baby came on a frozen night in late February, 3 weeks before Elena's calculations said she was due. The labor was long and difficult, Martha Harrison and Doc Harrison both working through the night, while Silas paced the main room and tried not to panic. Elena remembered little of it afterward, just pain and fear, and Martha's steady voice telling her to push, to breathe, to keep fighting. When the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a furious cry that said she was alive and intended to stay that way, Elena burst into tears of relief and joy and exhaustion. Martha cleaned the child and wrapped her in a blanket, then placed her in Elena's arms. "A girl," Martha said, smiling, "healthy and loud. Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer." Elena looked down at the tiny red face, the screwed-up eyes, the miniature fists waving in indignation at being born into a cold world. She was perfect. She was real. She was theirs. "Silas," she called, and he came through the door so fast he nearly tripped over his cane. His face when he saw the baby was something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. Wonder and fear and love all mixed together, tears streaming down his cheeks without shame or apology. "Our daughter," Elena said, holding the child out to him. "Hold her." He took the baby with hands that shook, staring at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. "She's so small. She's strong. Feel how tightly she's gripping your finger." Elena watched him with the baby, this man who'd been told he was useless and broken, holding new life with infinite gentleness. "What should we name her?" They talked about names during the long winter nights, circling around options without committing to anything. But now, looking at their daughter's face, Silas said, "Clara, after my grandmother. She was the only one in my family who didn't give up on me after the accident. Clara Mercer." Elena tested the name, feeling how it fit. "I like it. It sounds like someone who won't take any nonsense from the world. She's going to need that growing up out here." Silas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, the baby still cradled in his arms. Growing up with parents who are scarred and limping and not like anyone else. Growing up with parents who love her and who will teach her that broken doesn't mean defeated. Elena reached out and touched Clara's tiny hand. "She'll be strong because we're strong, and she'll be kind because she'll grow up knowing what it costs to survive." Martha Harrison cleared her throat from the doorway. "I'll leave you three alone. The baby's healthy, Elena's doing well, and you all need rest. I'll check back in the morning." After she left, they lay there together, Elena in the bed, Silas beside her, and Clara between them, already sleeping the profound sleep of the very new. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside their small house, warmth and hope were building like a fire that wouldn't go out. "We did it," Elena whispered. "Despite everything, we actually did it." "Yeah." Silas's voice was thick with emotion. "We did. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the valley into something almost beautiful. The snow melted, revealing grass that was already green underneath. The trees budded. The creek ran high and clear. And on the small ranch at the edge of Bitter Hollow, two people who'd been thrown away by everyone who should have valued them raised their daughter and rebuilt their lives one day at a time. The town's attitude toward them shifted gradually. It started with Martha Harrison bringing baby clothes and offering advice on caring for a newborn. Then Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who'd always been polite but distant, stopped by with a basket of food and stayed to admire Clara. Other women followed, drawn by curiosity about the mail-order bride and the crippled rancher who'd somehow made their impossible situation work. Elena received them all with careful courtesy, never quite trusting the sudden friendliness but appreciating the practical help. And slowly, grudgingly, she began to believe that maybe the town wasn't entirely populated by people who delighted in others' suffering. Maybe most of them were just trying to survive too, and her success gave them something to hope for in their own struggles. By Clara's first birthday in February of the following year, the ranch was thriving. They had 4 new foals, a rebuilt barn, and enough money in the bank to hire seasonal help for the heavy work. Silas still limped, Elena still bore her scar, but neither defined them anymore. They were simply the Mercers, hardworking, resilient, proof that you could build something good from broken pieces if you refused to give up. On Clara's birthday, they invited Martha Harrison and her husband for dinner. It was a simple meal, roast chicken, vegetables from Elena's garden, a cake that was lopsided but tasted fine. But it felt momentous because it was the first time they'd entertained anyone in their home. The first time they'd opened their private space to outsiders and trusted that it wouldn't be violated. After dinner, while Clara played on a blanket by the fire and the adults drank coffee, Doc Harrison cleared his throat. "I owe you both an apology," he said. "When Elena came to me last year, bleeding and terrified, I judged her. Thought she was foolish for attempting that cattle drive while pregnant. But I was wrong. You weren't foolish, you were desperate and brave and trying to save everything you'd built. That takes courage I'm not sure I have." Elena glanced at Silas, then back at the doctor. "We did what we had to do, same as anyone else." "No, not the same. Most people in your situation would have given up, sold out, moved somewhere easier. But you fought for this place, for each other, and you won." Harrison raised his coffee cup. "That's worth celebrating." They touched cups, the gesture awkward but genuine. And Elena realized that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic triumph or vindication, but quiet recognition that they'd done something difficult and succeeded, that they'd earned their place in this harsh valley and in each other's lives. After the Harrisons left, Elena and Silas sat by the fire while Clara slept between them, her small chest rising and falling with perfect trust that she was safe and loved. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't answered your advertisement?" Elena asked. "If I'd chosen one of the other men or decided not to come west at all?" "All the time. And it terrifies me because I know I wouldn't have made it without you. I'd have lost the ranch, probably lost my mind along with it." Silas picked up Clara's tiny hand, marveling at how small it was. "You saved me, Elena. You and Clara both. We saved each other. That's the point. Neither of us could have done this alone." "No, but together we did the impossible." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "The world expected us to fail. They threw us away like we were worthless. But we proved them wrong. We built this family, this life, from nothing but stubbornness and hope." Elena leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter sleep. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people, that I'd used up my chance at it and all I could hope for was survival. But this..." She gestured at the small room, the sleeping baby, the man beside her. "This is happiness. It's not perfect or pretty, but it's real, and it's ours." "Imperfect and real," Silas agreed, "just like us." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moving through the pine trees outside. Clara stirred, made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. And Elena thought about all the broken roads that had led her here. The violence, the grief, the desperate gamble on a man she'd never met. Every terrible thing that had happened had been necessary to bring her to this moment, this place, this family. She wouldn't change it, wouldn't wish away the scars or the pain or the fear, because they'd shaped her into someone strong enough to survive and build and love despite everything. The frontier had tried to crush them. The town had mocked them. Life itself had thrown every obstacle it could think of in their path. But they'd endured. They'd persevered. And in the end, they'd done more than survive. They'd created something beautiful from the wreckage. As Elena drifted towards sleep that night, Silas's arm around her, and Clara's small weight against her chest, she thought about all the people who'd called them broken, who'd assumed they were too damaged to make anything worthwhile. Those people had been wrong. Broken things could be mended, wounded people could heal, and sometimes the strongest foundations were built on fractured ground. The valley stretched out beyond their window, vast and harsh and unforgiving. But inside their small house, warmth and love and hard-won hope were growing. And that, Elena thought, was the real frontier. Not the land you conquered, but the life you built despite every reason to give up. They'd been thrown away, discarded, deemed worthless by a world that measured value in the wrong ways. But they'd proved that worth wasn't determined by what you'd lost or how badly you'd been damaged. It was measured by what you built with the pieces that remained. And Silas and Elena Mercer had built something extraordinary. A family, a home, a life that honored both their scars and their strength. They'd rewritten the story the world had written for them, turning tragedy into triumph one stubborn day at a time. The crippled rancher and the scarred widow hadn't just survived the frontier. They'd made it bow to them, accepting them on their own terms. And in doing so, they'd shown everyone watching that the most powerful thing a person could do was refuse to stay broken. Their daughter would grow up knowing that, would learn from watching her parents that damage didn't define you, that love was something you fought for and earned, and that the strongest people were often those who'd been tested the hardest and refused to break. Clara Mercer would never be pitied or dismissed or told she couldn't achieve something because of where she came from. Her parents would see to that, because they knew better than anyone that your beginning didn't determine your ending. Only your courage and your refusal to quit did that. And as the fire burned down to embers and the small family slept together in the house that had been a prison before it became a home, the mountains stood silent witness to a truth the valley had learned, that sometimes the people everyone gives up on are the ones who build the strongest kingdoms. Not kingdoms of land or wealth or power, but kingdoms of love and resilience and the particular kind of strength that comes from surviving hell and choosing to believe in heaven anyway. That was the legacy Silas and Elena would leave their daughter. Not money or property or an easy life, but the knowledge that you could be broken and beloved, scarred and strong, damaged and still worthy of everything good the world had to offer. And in the end, that was worth more than all the perfect, unblemished lives in the world, because it was earned in blood and tears and the daily choice to keep building even when everything fell apart. They'd built their kingdom on broken ground, and it would stand for generations, a testament to the power of two people who refused to let the world's judgment become their truth.